a motion for the approval of minutes of the July 20 meeting?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes from the July meeting.
I'll second that.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion carries. Public comment. Is there anyone here to talk about an issue that is not already on the agenda for tonight's meeting? Amy, do you have any indication that there's anybody interested in doing that?
No, I do not.
Okay, then we can move on to the approval of tonight's agenda. I'll entertain a motion.
Bob, you're muted.
So moved.
Thank you.
Second.
Any conversation? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? On to new business. Rocky Ridge Section 5 preliminary subdivision plan.
On June 25th of this year, staff received from Pentair Engineering a preliminary plan for the new section of the Rocky Ridge development, which would create 13 residential lots connecting the existing development with K Street in Kaywood. All lots will be served by public water and sewer, and the street section proposed will eventually be dedicated to the township. 2 reviews of the plan have been completed, the second of which was included with the agenda, as well as a plan sheet showing the proposed lots. A few comments remain, all of which can be addressed in a timely fashion. Staff's recommendation is to move to approve recommend approval of the Rocky Ridge Section 5 preliminary subdivision plan contingent upon the satisfactory completion of all outstanding review comments. John Sepp from Pentair Engineering is in on the call, and between us, I think we can answer any questions you might have.
Are we?
I have a question for John.
Go ahead.
Are you going to be able to address the issue about adding an inlet at the intersection of K and Rocky?
I just got those comments today, Kent, and I haven't really had a chance to look at it, but I'm sure we could work something out. Personally, I don't think one's required, but I'll work that out with Jerry one way or the other.
Okay.
I have a question. This is when you're coming up into Old Kaywood. You go up 60 or 80 yards and hang a left. This is immediately to the right, out in that old field. Is that right?
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And so, any way that the neighbors there, knowing about this added road, would have been made aware of it?
The connection to K Street, Chris?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, that's been talked about since this plan was first discussed back in 2009. So they're well aware that it's going to connect at some point.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Does it require any improvements to the intersection of 45 and K Street?
No.
Okay. I mean, I'm perfectly okay with where we're going, provided, as Todd says, that we satisfactorily complete all of the outstanding review comments, which is a trend we do quite often.
Move to accept based on the proposal and satisfactory completion of the outstanding notes.
I'll second that.
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. On to old business. Utility scale solar energy systems.
Okay, so at last month's meeting, the Planning Commission talked about how the next part of your discussion of alternative energy regulations should be about solar as a primary use. So utility scale solar. And what I'd like to do this evening is just go through a PowerPoint presentation that I prepared that gives an overview of what these systems are and kind of some of the trends that we've been seeing in development of these systems. So let's see here. Everybody can see that okay, I assume?
Hmm.
All right. So what is a utility scale solar energy system? These systems generate power for off-site use. Basically speaking, these are a power plant. It's probably the best way to describe them. They distribute power onto the community grid for the wholesale market, and they're regularly referred to as a solar farm. These uses are not necessarily new in the industry. They've been around since the 1980s, at least in the Southwest, but they are definitely becoming more common in other parts of the country, and there's a number of reasons for that. Just here to understand, in Pennsylvania, they're not regulated by the Public Utility Commission, but rather by a regional transmission organization referred to as the PJM. For those of you who attended or zoomed into the joint meeting on July 22nd, you probably heard our guest presenters mention PJM several times and how that's who they have to go through to get approval to connect. And generally speaking, a lot of these types of systems are developed on a scale of about 10 to 100 megawatts. There are certainly larger ones, but I think here on the East Coast, 10 to 100 is more likely what we would see based on the availability of land. So some things that Todd and I have learned about, we've been taking a lot of webinars, watching a lot of webinars from Penn State this summer about utility scale solar. And there's a couple things we've learned about from these, as well as reaching out to other experts and things we've read online. First off, I think it's pretty evident these are going to require a significant amount of land. The estimate I put in here is 4 to 8 acres per megawatt. I've seen as high as 10 acres. I've seen as low as 3. My understanding is that the more megawatts you end up having produced, the more land you typically need to have dedicated because of additional infrastructure needs. Obviously, land that has solar access is important. So property that's free of trees, buildings, mountains, or anything else that might cast a shadow on where the sun would be shining normally. They obviously want to locate places where they're guaranteed solar access throughout the majority of the day. Another thing that's very important to a lot of these developers when they're coming to develop these uses is proximity and access to 3-phase distribution lines and electrical substations. This isn't entirely necessary, but is typically where they're going to try to locate, because if they go to places that don't have these two infrastructure elements close by, they're going to have to provide them, and it's very expensive to do so. Now, electrical substations, I think, are pretty easy to know where they're at because we can see them. These 3-phase distribution lines, I don't know what they look like, just driving down the road, and unfortunately, the power company is unable to provide that information for national security reasons. But this is the type of things that a solar farm developer, somebody looking to build a utility scale solar system, would be looking for. And then flat land or land with minimal slopes are also preferred. They're not entirely necessary, but depending on the lease agreement and the costs and the land itself, if they have to do a lot of leveling or anything like that, they typically prefer to avoid places that they have to deal with a lot of slope issues. So there's a lot of benefits as well as some drawbacks to utility scale solar. Some of these benefits are probably more on a national scale, such as this is the cleanest domestic energy source available. It results in decreased CO2 emissions for generating power and completely eliminates sulfur, nitrous oxide, and mercury emissions. It supports national priorities such as national security, job creation, climate change mitigation, and things of that nature. Generally, it generates very little traffic after it's been constructed, and it's fairly low maintenance. And unlike a lot of other mainstream power generation sources like nuclear, coal, gas, or hydroelectric, you don't need to be close to water, major highways, or rail in order to have one of these uses established. There are definitely some drawbacks, and these tend to be more local. For starters, they do use a substantial amount of land for at least a generation or two, possibly longer. These uses can't be converted to another use, so there needs to be a plan for decommissioning, unlike a building that could maybe be used for something else. Once the solar use is gone, the poles that are in the field really don't have any other valid use for them. There's certainly aesthetic and property value and environmental concerns from adjacent properties. Environmental tends to be a little less common, but there are definitely people that get concerned about the different elements and different materials that are in the panels themselves, and any of that possibly somehow getting into their groundwater, things of that nature. I think in general, this could be described as a not in my backyard use by some people, just because they feel that having to look at this has ruined their property or their property values. And I know that there's a project right now being proposed out in Potter Township, and we've had some folks calling us at Harris Township because they believe that it's in our township, and that's typically the kind of feedback we've received, is they just don't want this to be next door to them. As I mentioned earlier, there are obviously economic limitations that affect where these can be established. So while there might be perfectly good land to put these on somewhere out in the hinterlands, if those other things that you need, like the 3-phase power lines and the substation, isn't close by, it's going to limit where these are going to be established just for economic reasons. And another thing that's really common is there's a lot of municipalities that are definitely unprepared to deal with the impact this might have on local resources, especially when they're being developed. In particular, maybe not in the case of places in the center region, but I know I've read some, I guess, horror stories of these smaller communities that have a utility scale solar farm get built, and they don't have enough code inspectors or people that are experts enough in code inspection to be able to deal with one of these projects being constructed. And a lot of places lack adequate regulations, so they're kind of already behind the times when a developer shows up, and they may end up adopting regulations without realizing that they're inadequate to actually address some of the issues that these uses can present. So as far as recent trends in utility scale solar development, there's been a substantial growth of these uses over the past decade. As I put here in the slide, there was 1.2 gigawatts of power generated by solar in 2008. It jumped to 30 gigawatts in 2019. A lot of this has to do with technological advances that have really resulted in lower production costs and greater efficiency of these systems. There's also been some improved battery technologies, although I believe there's still a long way to go from what I understand to helping to store this power for later use on cloudy days. There are a lot of federal and state tax credit programs that help to incentivize this development. Some of these federal tax credit programs are going to be going away soon. So there's a federal tax credit that was 30% up until the year, 30% of the cost of the system up until 2019. It declines, I believe, to 22% in 2020. And then it declines again, I believe, in 2021. And then by 2022, it's entirely gone. That certainly could be renewed, but currently it's on the decline and will likely expire. There's also solar renewable energy credits. These had been valued fairly highly, but with COVID and some other factors in the market, they're also on the decline. One local expert in this that I ended up getting some information from said that there's a literal cliff coming in regards to these energy credits. But nonetheless, there still apparently is a lot of pressure to develop these projects. It's still considered a pretty strong market at the moment, and there's what was just described to me as a land grab scenario where a lot of development firms are going in and they're signing leases with property owners. They may never actually develop on the property, but they're doing everything they can to tie up land that has viability just so that competitors can't get it, and they then can try to see what will play out in terms of actual development. And anything that is typically leased, it's normally 2 to 3 years after the leasing process even begins before they would look at physically developing the property into a solar, utility scale solar installation. So in terms of developing one of these, land is typically leased in most cases where the property owner receives payment from the lease. It's very common for these leases to include more land than what may end up being utilized. So it was my understanding a couple of the webinars we attended had had to do with leasing, that sometimes property owners think they're going to have, 50 acres used and they end up only developing 10 acres. So they only get paid for the 10 acres that were used. Leases are typically two-phased, where the companies will come in and there will be an initial payment while they're exploring whether or not the property will work, and then an increased payment if they actually end up developing it. One thing that Todd and I have talked about a lot with this is a lot of the developers and kind of in this market will define the use as a temporary use. I think we can agree that certainly the leases themselves are for a limited period of time, and the panels probably at some point would need to be replaced. But a lot of leases, while they may expire in 20 to 40 years, they may have options to auto renew, where the company doing the lease gets to make the decision. It's not really the property owner's choice. They have the option to just continue to renew this for another 20 to 40 years. And there's also no guarantee that another company wouldn't come on and take over a lease and simply replace whatever equipment needs replaced, since there's already been a fair amount of cost put into developing what is already on the property. It might be economical just to replace what is needed to keep it going. So where are these developed? And this is a little bit of what I know the guest presenters had talked about back in July. These are typically proposed in or developed in areas where land is, first off, readily available. So again, you need a lot of land. Affordable, that's a key here. Most of these companies don't want to be leasing property that's in prime commercial areas or prime industrial areas and meets the criteria for access. So brownfields and industrial areas that maybe are underdeveloped or struggling, former strip mines, reclaimed landfills, and of course farmland has become a recent trend in terms of development of utility scale solar. So as far as some local examples, in our multi-municipal planning area, College Township does permit utility scale solar in their general industrial district. They also have facilities at the UAJ and the Mount Nittany Medical Center, but those are actually accessory uses to those institutions because they provide power to those facilities. I'm certain some of you may have seen these when you've been on 99 or over by the hospital. You can see these solar these accessory solar farms that I have here on the screen. Patton Township also permits these uses, utility scale solar, in their commercial 1 and commercial 2, planned airport district, industrial district, natural resources district, and then also as a conditional use in their agricultural and natural resources 2 district. And this is outside of the center region, but in Potter Township, they currently have a large system that was permitted on the Bergenblick farm, which actually is partially in Harris Township. It's our understanding that they were not going to be having any of the actual solar energy system infrastructure in Harris Township, but we haven't received, I don't think, any type of validation yet from the company to confirm that. And it's our understanding this was permitted as an essential service, which is a conditional use in Potter Township. So some of the questions that we think that the Planning Commission should consider, and we'd like to get some feedback on, first and foremost, is should Harris Township permit utility scale solar as a primary use in the township? And if so, considering the land requirements and some of the potential impacts that might be faced, which zoning district or districts could be appropriate for these uses? So that concludes my presentation this evening. And I think if you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. And if you have any feedback on these questions, we'd appreciate it.
Before you go to questions, Bill, I just have 2 pieces of public comment that I thought I could read since they pertain to this. So the first is from Terry Engelder. Terry's from Boalsburg, Pennsylvania. He's a professor of geosciences emeritus at Penn State. And he said, given the existential threat of global climate change, Harris Township has, in my opinion, a moral obligation to seize upon every opportunity to reduce its carbon footprint. And then the next comment is from Judy and John Dranoff. They live up in Orchard Hill off of Windmill Road. And they said, we oppose solar panels being placed on areas zoned agriculture. We think they are ugly and will spoil the rural beauty of Harris Township.
Is there anybody on the phone as part of the meeting that has anything they would like to say regarding this before we open it up to the rest of the board? Do I take that as a no?
Yes.
I'm not hearing anything, Amy. Did we get any response?
We did not, so you're good.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, anything you'd like to talk about before I throw my 2 cents in?
Bob has a comment.
Question, question for Mark. So these, you said that they need to be 10 to 100. What was the megawatt range? They need
The typical megawatt range of development is 10 to 100 megawatts. It's not always I mean, there's times when they are smaller, but 10 to 100 tends to be a pretty common range for utility scale installations.
So really in Harris Township, unless somebody goes together, a couple farms go together, the maximum you see is probably 10 megawatt type facility.
Yeah, probably 10 to 15 megawatts, at least for some of the properties that I can think of that, you know, if you're looking at, 5 acres per megawatt, you need 50 acres to do that, to do 10. So there, yeah, it really comes down, I think, to, again, there's that range. There's not even an industry standard to define what a solar farm is. So there's just a lot of ranges given for a lot of this information.
So I guess my point is, what is my point? One, it's going to be difficult to have such a farm in Harris Township for viability, right? I mean, there might be some properties that could fall into this and use it.
Sure.
Okay.
Chris has
Can I say?
Chris, I saw your hand.
Thank you. To build on top of Bob's point, the presentation made it pretty clear that because of their desire currently to be near infrastructure like 3-phase lines and substations, there's not a lot of demand for solar farms at this time in this area. So I think it really puts the demand pretty low on the scale at this point. Again, we got to be thinking long term, so that what makes it kind of complicated.
And my question is, given the list of places that they tend to be located, how many of those are real options in Harris Township? It seems to me that it's just agriculture.
Out of the list of common ones, yes, I agree.
And so that's what it seems to me that's what we're really talking about.
I would agree with that, Amy, especially given the amounts of land required, and the scarcity of land in the other zoning districts.
George, can you speak? George, can you speak up? We cannot hear you. We're having trouble hearing you.
Well, that's better.
Better?
I'm sorry.
Okay.
You're not helping, Bob.
Bob's not being helpful.
No. He meant better in an existential sort of way. No, yeah, agricultural because of just by default relative to land availability and the other zoning types.
Yes, Bob.
Okay.
Amy, have you talked to any of the farmers?
About this? No, we have not.
So I was just wondering if there was any interest. I know that's kind of a short-term perspective, but just thinking about, do they have an interest, or what do they think about leasing their land, because these leases are what you say, a generation or two? So you're 25 to 50 years of lease.
Yeah, we have not spoken to them.
Mm-hmm. And I think that was one of the major points of the presenters, is that this gives farmers an alternative to offer their children, grandchildren, that doesn't require them to farm. And so since that seems to be what we're talking about, I think we do want to hear from farmers.
Yeah, it's a good idea. How do you do that in a fair way, or at least get a variety of viewpoints?
Well, what we've done in the past, now farmers are a difficult challenge because their schedule is like completely opposite of our schedule, right? Because of the nature of their business. But what we've done in the past when we've had issues related to when we were working on the rural district stuff, we would send out letters to them and then invite them to provide feedback, or we would have an open house in the middle of the day. Certainly an open house is problematic because we can't have more than 25 people in the room right now. But we could certainly send them a letter and say, hey, Harris Township is at the very beginning of this process, and here's kind of what we're talking about. Send them the information from Mark's PowerPoint, and then ask them, is this something? Because, when we've talked with Candy Wasson in the past, of the Wasson Farm, Candy would tell you that, she has people that tell her all the time she's crazy because she still wants to farm her land, because in State College, it's more cost effective to farm houses, right? It's better to sell off. But I don't know if that's changing now because of the landscape, changing things that are going on with COVID or whatever. But I think we send them a letter, send them the information, and ask them to provide feedback. We have a very good core group of farmers in this township that will, when they have time, they don't, they very busy people, but they will respond to us when we do ask them. And I think they like having input. So that's something we definitely can do.
And give them an opportunity to get in on the ground floor of this, because we are at the very early stages of this. I have comments. One of them is kind of a question. First off, you mentioned, Mark, that the leasing and development companies consider a lot of this stuff to be temporary. I'm sorry, from an existential point of view, everything is temporary, but 20 years strikes me as being a little more permanent. So to class it that way is something that I would have great issue with, because you're putting something in that, even though it can be removed, it's not being placed there as a short-term installation. The other thing is, we talked at the meeting where they gave us the presentation about the community solar aspect. I'm wondering whether, when we start putting all of this together, whether we're going to have two standards, one for community and one for commercial. So that's just something I wanted to throw out that we should keep in mind as we go.
Amy?
Yeah.
This is Paul.
Hi, Paul.
I've made several notes on some of the comments that have been made. Maybe I could throw in some concepts and ideas. For instance, how much industrial property is available in Harris?
Mark or Todd?
I don't think we have a lot of industrially zoned land. Most of it's out by Discovery Drive, and most of it is developed at this point.
But most of it's taken up or absorbed.
Right.
Yes.
At this point.
It's a handful of acres, I think.
So at this point, you're talking basically farmland then when you get down to it.
Yeah.
A couple of things that I would like to discuss is how to control underground water contamination with continued farming in a lot of areas with sewage system and with fertilization of farmland. is I just moved into a new home here after a couple of weeks ago, but my water was tested and we have contamination from underground fertilization and sewage. I was surprised, and I'm about a half mile away from almost any projects or homes, somewhat. But it seems to be there regardless. And so I can see some benefits out of this. The fact that when you're talking about leasing that for 20 to 40 years, but a question becomes in my mind, where?
Paul, are you still there?
Yes, can you hear me?
No, you broke up. Can you repeat what you just said?
Okay, on 20 to 40 years on leasing, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. We don't know where we're going to be 20, 40 years from now, whether the university will still be here or not, the way things are going right now. But things are changing, but instead of leasing, there are options of purchasing land from farmers. And it does help farmers with their decisions on retiring or as older age with younger families that do not want to farm anymore, that it gives them an option. And that leads me to the next question of, okay, so you have 50 acres, and would it be acceptable to go to 50% of the open space requirement to do solar, and the other 50% do home sites or development? Developments are coming to Harris more and more. And so I think we need to think about that, because once we start building more homes, now you've got more traffic flow on 45, you got more police protection. But right now with farmland, the taxation on farmland is growing. And my farm here is, my farm was not farmed this summer because a farmer had broken his leg and couldn't really farm it well. So I've taken a loss on that, but the taxes continue to increase on farmland. If there was a way to decrease farmland taxation to help the farmer, that would be great, but it ain't going to happen. So, but with the potential of solar farming, now you have an increased taxation back to the township and to the school district. So there's a lot of other things involved here that you folks may not be familiar with that I am, and other farmers are, that won't speak out or won't take that time or interest. Now, I must tell you, I've had over the past year and a half, probably year and a half, about 8, 9, 10 firms nationwide calling me. And I told them that we don't have legislation or ability to do anything, but I've had calls from Toronto, from Chicago, California, North Carolina. This is a hot area, and I think we need to really look at it to see what potential there is in a benefit to the farmers and to the landowners, not just ignoring them, because there is a problem with the taxation. My farming lease does not pay the taxes on my property here. So,
Really helpful.
pardon me?
That's a help. These are helpful points to be mindful of, Paul. Thank you.
So anyway, I mean, I have a few more, but the point is getting that information out to you folks for more discussion or the thought process of deciding which way we all want to go in the township. Thank you.
I have a question. Can you hear
Okay.
me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Why do we call it a farm? It's not a farm anymore. It's a generation plant. And if it's not a farm, what is it? Do we have anything for gas farming, coal farming, quarry farming? I mean, that's kind of the bag that you're opening up here. And then my second question is, everybody keeps talking about that it's going to be good for taxation. Maybe you can explain how that would be, Amy. Would you make more money on a solar farm to the Harris Township? Would you tax it different if it's a generation plant and no longer being farmed? What would you consider? And what would you consider that land use then?
So on the tax question, I'm not quite sure what Paul was referencing about the farmers are taxed more, because we have clean and green in this county. So as long as land is being actively farmed, it's my understanding, and I could be wrong, but it's my understanding that the farmers pay 50% of the assessed value, 50% of the taxes. And then when that farm is sold and it's no longer being farmed, they have to pay the back taxes on it. So maybe that's what he's referencing. As far as taxes on the solar panels, I don't know that solar panels are considered, basically when you do taxation in the county, you do the land and then you do improvements on the land. And that's a good question for the assessment office as to what they consider the solar panels. Are they considering them, and how are they valuing them? Because, right, your houses are all valued at a certain percentage or a certain amount. I don't know what they do with the solar panels, but that's certainly something that we can ask the assessment office about that.
Yeah.
And as far as land use is concerned, generally speaking, like the American Planning Association and a lot of places define this as a light industrial use. To your point about it not truly being a farm, is considered light industrial.
Mm-hmm.
So are we opening up a can of worms in that regard, that once we've opened that agricultural land to light industrial, others could come in and ask to do the same?
I think that's always a potential, with or without it being a land use there. There are probably people that have argued that agriculture is light industrial. It's typically something, though, that's considered more industrial in nature.
Yeah,
And to go back to the question about taxes, I'm certainly no tax expert, but it seems to me, not being argumentative at all, that township gets a lot of its taxes from larger properties whenever those properties are subdivided and the lots change hands. We get transfer tax. We get half of the 1%. We won't get any of that if these large properties are leased, and even if they're sold rather than leased, we'll get the transfer tax one time. So there might be a net negative when you compare the two development scenarios of residential development or 10-acre lot development on larger tracts. Not necessarily residential development, could be larger lots that can be farmed, but each of those lots would generate a transfer tax when they're sold to the township that we wouldn't get with solar farming or some other commercial use.
I just remember from the solar panel that we had that Steve Greer and the boys kept talking about how it was going to be tax advantage for us to allow solar panels here, and I don't know the specifics of that. I couldn't understand, well, how? Why would this be advantageous to Harris Township, in at least in the form of taxes?
Yeah,
it doesn't seem to be.
I think
It doesn't
Jeff,
seem to.
right, it doesn't seem to be. And I think there's some questions we need to ask of the assessment office as to how they handle those panels. And
there's a lot of things said during a sales pitch that don't necessarily translate later well. So.
So can you do the solar, can you allow solar farms and not, what would you consider not light industrial then? I mean, when you're planning on writing this zoning law, what are you saying? Solar panels are okay, but no, we don't want a coal strip mine? I mean, or we do not want Marcellus shale gas coming through and putting wells all over the property on our ag district? Or is that already okay to do?
We already
Well,
have.
no, I think if this was something that the planning commission and wanted us to work on drafting, we would have to determine how that would be worded specifically. I don't think that we currently allow mining in our ag district, and I don't think it's proposed in any of our revisions either. So, I think ultimately it is up to the township what types of uses you want to allow, and there is ways of restricting other uses that you don't want. So I don't think this is necessarily going to guarantee any light industrial use if you were to go down this road.
It can be written in a way that would prevent that.
Sure.
Mhm.
Amy, can I speak up here for a minute?
Actually, I think Bob Igo wanted to say something. Bob, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I did. Now, Mark, when your readings and you and Todd, what were the objections from an aesthetic standpoint? I mean, is there anything really foundational, or is it more like, I don't want it in my backyard?
At least from what I recall, most of it was strictly that these property owners had always assumed it would either be farming or maybe homes at some point, but not just a giant array of solar panels next door. And there are definitely ordinances that require screening and buffering to try to help with that, but nothing's perfect. I know, like in the example of the one over in Potter Township, that's on some undulating farmland. So there's going to be certain panels, no matter how much screening they put along the edge of the property, you're going to see it from adjacent properties. And I imagine there's probably some concerns with reflecting, even though there's anti-glare, regulations and things to try to cut down on that. There's still always that concern that you're going to wake up and see this thing lining your home or what have you. But it's mostly just, it's not what people always thought would be there, is what I recall.
George,
Mark, if I may. Oh, am I off?
you're on.
Again?
No, you're on.
Mark, your presentation said for Patton and College Township that there were conditions related to the use of these, or the allowability of these in the agricultural zone. Can you give us some sense of what kind of conditions were involved?
Well, I think what I was referring to is that Patton Township allows these as a conditional use in 2 districts. That is a process that's outlined by the MPC, where you have to have a public hearing and the governing body can basically put conditions of approval on a project that are more stringent maybe than what is in the ordinance itself. I don't recall all of the different regulations they have for these uses. I can certainly do more research on that if you'd like. I don't recall Patton having much of anything. I think, I know College Township has a very comprehensive set of regulations, but I believe those were only for their accessory uses, not for their primary. So I'd have to go back and check if Patton had any specific conditions they called out, or if they just allowed it to be something that was defined through the conditional use permit process, which I know Todd and I are not necessarily big fans of that process, because it's somewhat arbitrary. It's better to have things spelled out in the ordinance if you can.
That's helpful to hear. I was just going to ask that very question.
Amy, may I speak up?
Yeah, go ahead, Paul.
A couple of things that I would like to relate to all of you is the fact that the farming land, the owners of land, need to be considered, not just thrown back to where it has been for the last 50, 100 years. Some people are speaking out. They don't want to see this. They don't want that to happen to farmland. But if they want to enjoy seeing things that somebody else paid for and is living with. For instance, 15 years ago, the real estate market collapsed along with the stock market collapsed and reduced the land values by about 50% roughly. And I don't know that they've ever regained that loss of value. So there's farmers and landowners. I'm not a farmer per se, but I'm a landowner. And at my age, I want to retire away from my land. And I think that there are other families that would like to do something, but they're stuck with the regulations and restrictions under the Harris Township guidance on development and everything else. But you hear some other people, I don't like this and I don't like that. Well, we may not like a lot of things, but there are changes coming, and because of the growth of the university and growth of the whole area. So I think you need to consider opportunities for owners of big land parcels to work something out with the township, or work to plan out an estate situation, because they've got millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars tied up in their land. Now, if somebody wants to come forward and to buy it, that's fine. Or to pay the taxes and to pay the maintenance or whatever, that's okay. But nobody comes forward ever. So it's the suffering and or hurting for the tax purposes, and the economy today and what's happening today. It's not an easy situation. I could rattle on, but I'll let it go at that. Thank you.
If I could real quick, just to answer George's previous question, I pulled up the Patton Township regulations. As I mentioned, College Township, they don't have any specific regulations that I could find for their primary energy systems, solar energy systems. Patton Township does. They're pretty minimal. It's just screening requirements, fencing requirements. They have some glare regulations, and that's about the extent of what they have. There's also some things in there about removal being required if it's abandoned, but they're very minimal in any other type of restrictions.
Chris?
You know, I think that there are some real benefits to providing opportunities for solar, and there are some downsides too. So it's good that we have had, you know, you guys doing your research and giving us this briefing, having the presentation last month. There's a lot to kind of digest here. And I wonder if we're at the point of deciding, you know, do we ask for more information and a further development of plan, or are we not wanting to move forward with exploring this any further? I think maybe the balance is more to the positive and developing an opportunity, but it might help us to move forward with what needs to happen next to figure that out. And I'll just leave it at that.
So,
Is that a motion?
Yeah, Amy, are we at a point where a straw poll of the board might be in order to determine whether we want to move forward or what?
well, I think Kent would like to say something first. He was waving his hand.
Yeah, I just,
Okay.
if we were to consider this, I mean, I believe, Mark, you said that probably the smallest farm you could reasonably have would be around 50 acres. Is that correct?
That's based on some of the standards that we saw. Yes, that's probably a reasonable number.
So
And remember, that's only current technology. Kent, sorry to cut you off. That's only current technology. In 30
Yep.
years, 5 acres could produce what today 50 acres produces. We got to be thinking long-term here.
Okay. Well, and I would say if we were to consider this, there's two things I would want to mention. And I think as far as Harris Township is concerned, I don't think a really large one would work well. So I think we should put a cap on the acreage size that would be allowed for one, you know, something on the order of 50. And if we and I'm not opposed to putting this out for public comment and public comment from the farming community, but I think maybe we should give them an example of what we're thinking about, you know, something of that size. And my only other comment was that you talked about decommissioning. I think that if we were going to have it, we should definitely have some regulation that would require a bond for decommissioning the project.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah.
So those are just my two comments.
They were good ones.
Yes, they were.
Guys,
I
think
say
that-
move forward. I make a motion for us to move forward, for you guys to give us more information.
Do I hear a second?
I'll second that.
Second,
Any further discussion tonight?
Well, can I ask you, what specific information you'd like us to come back with?
Investigate the zoning, investigate the taxes. I'd like Mark to put together a thing, what 50 acres and a piece of property would look like with solar panel, with this incredible computer expertise. And then I think we should talk about having public input.
I think public input's starting to be good.
I would be interested in seeing Mark and Todd putting something together that we would put out to the public, something, this is what we would put out for them, for the public to comment on.
Yeah, I'm all in favor of moving along towards something, towards progression down that road. I think we should think about it, try to be innovative about how we use it, because, Chris, to your point, the regulation we create today, okay, could be the hindrance, okay, of technology and innovation in the future. All right, so we need to think about this very carefully, how we go about it. I'd probably have to be fairly expeditious about it as well, because I'm sure there's going to be potential competition. But I agree with you. Things are going to change. Technology will change. So if technology changes, how do you handle this move from, it's going to be 50 acres down to 5? It's going to be 5. So I'm shut up. I've had enough.
I think it would be good for us as a board to see what some other entities have done. As Kent pulled up patents, see what other counties, what other local entities are doing, and how they're wording their regulations to figure out whether or not they're looking at something that we aren't considering yet. I think that might, to some degree, bring in where Bob and Chris have mentioned that, we can't future-proof it, but we can certainly look at the possibilities of what can happen and maybe what's happened in the last 10 years as the technology has improved, and see what we can do. I don't know that we're going to be able to improve the leasing and the business end between the developers and the farmers, the landowners, but we can certainly make sure that once that lease is signed, we have some control over how things are installed and how much is installed, and then what the township might be on the hook for at a later point in time when the useful life cycle is over, so that we don't end up holding a bag.
Todd, are you feeling any more comfortable with anything?
Yeah, are you feeling any better about this, Todd?
You write all that down.
Yeah, I would say that Mark and I have spent months looking at dozens of solar ordinances. So I think a lot of Mark's presentation, a lot of the things we talked about are based upon the things that are already adopted other places. I think what we're trying to do is point out the similarities between those ordinances and say that, they're somewhat different. I think if the direction of the Planning Commission now is to sort of encapsulate some of that in an informational pamphlet that we would pass out to rural property owners to try and get some feedback from them, I think that's okay. But this can go any direction that we want it to go as far as Harris Township is concerned. So it's a little clearer than it was 5 minutes ago, but it's not crystal clear now.
Well, in my line of work, Todd, we call it a one sheet, which was basically a single-sided piece of paper, sort of the elevator pitch of what we wanted to do. Is it possible to get something together that would be the mailer that would go out seeking public input, that we can at least discuss at the next meeting to determine whether it covers the important aspects that we want input on and that we want to clarify ourselves?
If you folks tonight have put forth all those important aspects, yes. If there are other things that you want to know or that come up between now and the next meeting, we can certainly add that to whatever we prepare for the next meeting.
Can we agree that we will submit to Todd what we would like to have discussed within a couple of days by email?
I would suggest you submit it to Mark and I.
Okay. I'm up for that.
Oh,
Can I make an
by
alternative suggestion? Can we just get the notes from tonight's meeting and use that as the basis for this idea sharing and list sharing? I think we've had a robust conversation and covered a lot of important points. And they've already done a whole bunch of research. We could repeat
Yeah. Yeah, we can definitely do that. Deb typically does the minutes the very next day after the meeting while it's still fresh. So we can, get those over to you by the end of the week.
That'd be
and I
great.
sent
Then
out
we
a
can,
PDF of the PowerPoint right before the meeting started. If anybody hasn't
Good.
checked their email yet, you should have it.
perfect.
So where are we as far as a motion today?
You made a motion, Jeff made a motion and it was seconded by Kent to move forward and to get more information for the planning commission. I don't think you voted on it though.
Is that enough for the time being that we can move forward with that as a motion, or Todd,
Yes.
do you want some clarification written
That's
into
good
the
enough for me. If we end up giving you what you want, that's great. And if not, we can amend it.
All right.
Gee, thanks.
Have we then discussed this enough that we can vote on it?
Yes.
Yes.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion carries. Todd, we'll be in touch. Are we at a point where we can move along to the residential development capacity in the R1 zone?
Yes.
So, yeah, so back in, I think the last time we talked about the R1 zone may have been back in May. We had talked about family care homes and things of that nature. What we wanted to do to kind of move this along as you continue your review of the district was have a discussion with you about the minimum lot size and some of the other development trends in the zoning district. And to help with that, I prepared a memo that was included in the agenda that has some information on some historic development patterns, as well as some vacant land that's in the district. It's not fully inclusive of all of the vacant properties that there are, but these are the larger ones that are located inside of the growth boundary. And kind of the impact that lot sizes and developments can have on how much future housing we can accommodate on these properties. So from the historic trends, you probably noticed that for the most part, our minimum or our average lot sizes tend to be quite larger than the minimum 7,500 square feet that the ordinance requires. Now, I think the ordinance at one point had required 10,000 square feet, and it was reduced to 7,500 at some point to try to encourage greater density in R1 development. But for the most part, what we've seen is kind of a continuation of larger lots. As I noted on the second page there, in terms of vacant land, we have about 139 acres of vacant property in the growth boundary that could be developed on on a larger scale. Now, there's a lot of other smaller properties that might be an acre in size, that could be maybe split into 2 or 3 lots, something like that. But I think these properties that I listed, the 11 that were there, they really quantify the majority of the potential for large subdivisions where you'd have streets being installed, and other infrastructure to try to support the development. So, looking at kind of the number of lots that land could support on page 3, with our 7,500 square foot minimum lot size, if that were to be adhered to, we could get about 522 additional single family lots. But when we start looking probably closer to the 15,000 square feet or so, which is kind of close to our average size, that number gets cut in half. And I think that it's something that Todd and I have talked about over time, and really feel like it's something that the Planning Commission should be made aware of, and maybe float some ideas of how that could be improved. So like most zoning districts, the R1 zone, this minimum lot size, the idea behind it is you're basically allowing a maximum density. You'll never have more than one house for every 7,500 square feet of land. But there are regulations that other municipalities have established to try to also create a minimum density, just to ensure that land is being used efficiently. And understanding how, the township is part of the center region planning area. In a multi-municipal plan, we have a growth boundary that really determines where we try to encourage growth to occur. I think trying to encourage efficient development inside of our growth boundary is an important thing. So, what we want to do is just throw out this idea of, should we be looking at maybe trying to establish some type of a minimum density requirement in our R1 district? And it could probably take form in different ways, but it's just something we wanted to get your feedback on, if it's something you think would be worth looking into. And if so, we can definitely move forward in trying to do more research and bring some ideas forward to you. So I'd be happy to answer any questions or take any comments you have on that concept.
I have a question. So
Sure.
even if we decide to make a maximum lot size, is basically what you're asking us, because that gives us more density. So say you can't have more than 10,000 square feet. What stops anybody from buying an extra lot next door?
Well, nothing would stop them, and I think there's numerous cases in the township where that has happened, where there are property owners that own maybe even 2 or 3 lots next to them. But eventually, at least those properties can be developed for another home without having to go through a subdivision process to do it. And I think we've seen that happen in a couple cases. There's a lot of lots that are undeveloped on the hill, and I think there's some in Kaywood still, certainly out even in some of the ag zone residential developments we have. I know there's some undeveloped properties that probably at some point will develop.
Mark, I have a question. I don't see Rocky Ridge on the table. I'm wondering what their lot sizes are generally there. And then I'm wondering whether what we're going through right now from an economic standpoint may change the trend of what we've been seeing in the township, and people might want smaller lots in the future because of cost.
Sure. Well, on the Rocky Ridge question, that's actually agriculturally zoned. So that's why it wasn't included in the list. And while they do have very small lots, I think some of them are around 8,000 square feet, 8,500 square feet. It's important to remember there's also a large open space piece that when you factor that in, the average lot size is probably closer to about a half an acre, I think.
Which is how we would calculate it.
Right.
Okay.
I'll just comment that I could see us having a minimum density requirement for future subdivisions, but not necessarily a maximum lot size, because there's always going to be some lot somewhere, some oddball lot that you would not want to hold to some maximum, and maybe allow the developer to, take some areas that they could have a larger lot as long as they meet the minimum density requirements.
Yeah, I think the maximum lot size is an option, but there are other ways of regulating it to have a minimum density based on a project of a certain size. You can certainly go that route instead.
Interesting.
Mark, do you think that this is going to, what do you think demand's going to be for housing? And how do you think that this would affect it?
Well, with the current environment, it's hard to say what demand for housing is going to be in the future. In terms of how this type of a regulation would affect demand in the township, I think there's plenty of examples of other municipalities in the region that these smaller lots have been developed and they've been very successful. So I don't know that demand would change. And I think that there's certainly, at least from a lot of other areas of the country, there's a lot of evidence that people are looking for smaller lots. I actually saw something today about how there's a national trend. There's going to be an assumed shortage of single family rentals, like standalone single family homes that people will want to rent. So I think there's always going to be a demand, and obviously smaller lots could lead to smaller homes that might be more affordable as well. So that might be an opportunity for the township there to fill that void.
Just on that note, I think I've seen, I'm sorry, Chris, I cut in there.
No, you were first, Bob. Go ahead.
Housing prices tend to get jacked up. I mean, you've got the affordability issue on that. And I'm not speaking out against this. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm just kicking things around, what I've read on that. But the builders tend to jack up the prices on the house with amenities and things like that. So it's not a panacea for low-cost housing.
Yeah, I agree. I was thinking more affordable in the sense that it might be a little less expensive than something else, but not necessarily that anybody could just go in there and afford it. It's just more housing options, I guess, is the idea here.
I think the concept is really sound to explore, higher density of homes on smaller lots. I think there's a lot to like about that. And I also have to say that the growth projections from the center region planners over the next 40, 50 years, we got that a year or two ago. There's not a lot of growth expected. Now, this is a particular market that I think we do want to fill, so that might not really equate to that more strategic sort of global projection that they were doing. But just keep in mind, I think that we have a trend that's not a lot of growth. And again, these might be high demand kind of lots if we can do it right. Thank you.
Bob?
Does this go into the pocket neighborhood type of thing?
I would say this is separate from it, but I wouldn't call these the same.
Mark, we talked about this in the small area plan to some degree, didn't we?
We did.
Did we get
Yeah,
into?
we talked about this in particular on the
Whole property.
Right.
I'm sorry? Yeah,
On
Bowl
Bowl
property. Yep. Uh-huh.
Which, Mark, I have a question on. Not to get us off track here, but this lot number 5 on the map, and then
Yes.
subsequently referenced on the table 2. Is there a typo or a problem with the acreage as it relates?
No.
To that just developable acreage?
So that acreage is the portion of that property that's zoned R1. The remainder of the property is just commercial. So if you notice on the map, which in my light here is not the best to look at.
The yellow versus the
right.
pink.
The yellow is the area of that property that's actually R1. It's just that little piece that touches Main Street.
I personally like the idea of giving people the option to develop with smaller lots. I agree with Jeff that you're not going to be able to establish a maximum lot because people will just buy 3 or 4. I know in Kaywood there are a dozen different houses up there that are all situated in the middle of 2 lots. So, I mean, I like where we're going as far as looking at being able to perhaps go a little more dense. And I'm not sure what the difference here is with the pocket neighborhood versus what we're talking about here. Can you go into that a little more?
Yeah, I think the difference with the pocket neighborhood and every ordinance I've ever looked at related to them, they have a lot of standards for the road access. A lot of times they are condominiumized ownership where all the land around the homes is commonly owned. So they're not necessarily going to be set up like a traditional subdivision like we're talking about here.
But the usage and yield of acreage, you know, per house and dwelling is, you know, leaning that direction though.
Yeah, I think most pocket neighborhoods are probably, you know, an average lot size of 3,000 square feet or something like that. They're very low because the homes tend to be much smaller. They tend to be, you know, these cottage style homes that might have a 500 square foot or 600 square foot first floor footprint. So they're on much smaller lots overall, or much smaller open space areas. And they're typically also reserved for properties that are real infill development, maybe not something as large as 10 or 12 acres. They tend to be on, you know, little 1 or 2 acre parcels that are stuck in the middle of a area that hasn't developed yet.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah, hey Todd, when you're heading up Crestview, off of Church Street, and you're heading up to Miller Lane, why are those lots there are not in R1?
On the left-hand side, as you're going out Crestview Avenue, if those are the lots you're talking about that are
Rich
vacant.
Manning's place.
Yeah, I don't think those are zoned residential, but I'd have to check to make sure. I think they're zoned agricultural.
Oh, okay.
So where do we want to go with this tonight?
I don't understand what we're trying to do. I mean, are we discussing trying to make a minimum lot size more minimum? Or are we trying to discuss having a maximum lot size?
I think what we were asking for is if the Planning Commission has any interest in trying to establish a minimum density that needs to be met with any new development. That can take form in different types of regulations, but that was really the question we're putting out there is, does the Planning Commission feel it would be a good idea to try to ensure that future development meets some density requirement to make sure these properties are developed more efficiently and in a way that will try to extend the amount of growth we can accommodate on the land that we have in the growth boundary.
Gotcha. So basically what I said.
What? Yeah, I think
different regulations.
Yeah, it would be helpful for us to know what are the different regulatory pathways to get to a minimum density. So more education there. Maybe it's maximum, you know, maximum lot size or not.
Yeah, and I can bring examples for that to our next meeting and try to give you, you know, other locations and what they've done and how it's structured, if that would be helpful.
Great.
Yeah.
Yes. I'll say that I'm for it, and I'd like to see that structure. I think density is a good thing.
Yeah, and my concern is whether or not we can mandate it with what's left, or whether we can recommend it or incentivize it. I mean, how's everybody else feel about that?
I'm not feeling very good about mandate. That word mandate.
Yeah, I'd like to let it bounce around in my brain for a little bit, maybe till next meeting and come back, because I'm a little bit, if the demand in Harris Township is for larger pieces of property, and we crunch that into small, if we maximum in there, we could be kind of hosing ourselves. So.
I agree, Bob. They'll just move out to the agricultural area.
Yeah.
Well, I would suggest that once we get all the information that you're requesting, I think it's probably a bad idea to proceed with the idea that we're going to fill the ordinance with recommendations, because we've done that in the past. People are going to do whatever they're required to do. People tend to do the minimum they're required to do every time they do something. And that's something we've talked about for decades at planning commission and board meetings. If you have a bunch of recommendations in the ordinance, that's where they stay. Nobody ever uses them. So if we feel strongly enough about something to make it an ordinance that somebody has to follow, that's great. But if we're going to spend a lot of time coming up with recommendations to put in the ordinance, we may as well just move on to something else.
This may be an idea whose time has not yet come.
Or whose time has passed, because the Rocky Farm was developed as a 55 and older active adult community rather than an extension of our biggest section of R1. So 15 years ago, maybe this would have been the time to do that. Maybe we don't have enough land left to do it anymore.
So I would still be, in favor, at least looking at having a minimum density requirement, as long as we would have some allowances to, obviously to have some larger lots, and maybe even have an allowance for some residue lots that they could break out from it, just to give them some flexibility. And then, of course, some of those parcels are small enough that maybe it wouldn't even be worth it.
Are we good on this tonight?
I would like Mark and Todd to come up with, just take one piece of property and show me what you mean by minimum density. Can you do that?
Sure.
That's it for me.
Yeah, I'm open to investigating a little bit more next month with that sort of information, Andy. Shall we move on then?
Move on.
Okay, agenda for September, Amy?
Solar, R1. Any plans, Todd?
Try that one again. Amy, I lost you.
Solar and R1, and then Todd's gonna tell us if we have any plans.
There is always the chance that one of the stray plans that's been wandering around aimlessly for a couple years now might actually be submitted in revised form, and it might be something that our planning commission can look at, but I wouldn't hold my breath waiting for that.
Okay.
The possibility and probability are slim on both, right?
Yes, I would say so.
But we can't rule it out. So do we have any reports?
That looks so much nice.
Yes. The CRPR met, and you received today the summary of the meeting from Marcella Laird. So that's in your email inbox for your review. Some of the key components of that summary are that we are looking at adult uses in College Township because these have been zoned out, and we need to have some area designated as adult use permitted. So the area that's being looked at right now is the space by Macy's and McDonald's off Benner Pike as the, so we have,
A more fitting location.
apparently we have to have one. Otherwise we're vulnerable to suits. And so there has to be a designated place. And that's the place that is being looked at.
So
So-
designated porn shop.
Yeah. And so that's it.
Amy, excuse me.
Uh-huh.
Did I read it correctly where that says that it might include gaming facility?
Yes.
Okay.
Surprise, surprise.
So it's, yes, you're exactly right. This is not just adult toy shops or dance
Not that
places,
there's anything
but
wrong with that,
but it's also gaming. And as you remember, College Township is the one township in our region that has retained that as an option.
Mall-cino. That's what we want, the mall-cino.
Mall-cino, I like that.
Yeah. So, so that's being discussed right now. And if you have opinions about that, let me know. The other that I wanted to make mention of is that there's been a lot of adjusting or temporary permissions given during this pandemic. And this includes restaurants being permitted to serve in their parking lots and a variety of other things. And what the request is that what should be in our toolbox should the next emergency come? What should we be planning for and thinking about to anticipate the next emergency so that we're in a better position to be responsive and not as much scrambling? So this is just to begin the conversation. And if this is, they've asked if we would be willing to have a conversation about that, or at least float some idea generation so that there can be a discussion at a regional level.
Amy, did they have any bullet points to help us figure out what we're responding to?
Well, nope. It's just sort of what could be a recommendation for something that we always do. For example, I think one of the helpful strategies of this is that we now have the availability and the ability to meet online. So this would be something that ought to be in our toolbox and available should something happen. So what are other things that can be useful to us in thinking about the future?
Okay. Certainly a big can of worms.
Yeah, and so it's everything from, you know, if we're going to have driverless vehicles, or if we're going to have contactless delivery systems like drones. What do we want to think about for some of those things? Obviously, they are very robust conversations, each of those issues, but what is it that we want to have available as a resource so that we're not scrambling or making shoot from the hip decisions?
Sounds like a good approach.
Well, you think you can get a Corona Teeny delivered by drone?
Without spilling it?
I think the state stores would probably be willing to consider that.
So,
So
question
that's,
for you,
yeah, go ahead.
Amy, so is the regions leading this?
Yes.
Okay, are they going to provide scenarios for us?
No, but we can request them.
It will be kind of nice because it would
Yeah.
scenarios, different circumstances. So in case that there was a massive fire or massive smoke out or something like that, that would impact certain things that we, if we get into flooding, if we get into drought, I mean, those are different scenarios. Each one's going to have a different resource requirement.
Right. I will make that request.
Yeah, name your next disaster is kind of, what we're after.
Right. And I think there are too many unknowns there to have a full plan for any one thing, but there are things we can be doing, like having backup systems for meeting or communication that might be helpful to
I do like
facilitate
Bob's
decisions.
request to narrow things down a little, though.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. George,
Okay.
got anything?
A couple of updates. The technical committee met before our last planning commission meeting, but the long range transportation plan is out for public comment. That public review period began on the 14th and runs through September 14th. There's a Zoom meeting on the 2nd that will be the public meeting regarding questions about coordinating committee is expected to act on and move forward with that plan on September 22nd. There have been there's requests put on the table with the MPO as it relates to turning lane on Indian Hall Road, at Indian Hall Road and Route 45 because of the impact of Kaywood North development on the traffic pattern there. There's some speed signs in place on 322 with respect to the reduced speed limit down in the Laurel Meadow Lane and Timberwood Trail area. And there's been a fair amount of activity both at the MPO level and here in town as it relates to the startup of the SCAC project, the State College Area Connector project. And the consultants made several presentations and it will be in presentation process to involve the public and interested agencies going forward for quite some time.
What? George,
something they're calling.
What's that project? What's
320. That's 322, Bob.
322.
Okay, thank you.
It now has a name.
Yeah, State College Area Connector.
They're using what they're calling a Pell process, which basically PennDOT and the Highway Authority going through first an update to the studies that had been done, new data collection, and then from that, a Chinese menu, if you will, of alternatives in terms of routings, environmental issues, and the list goes on before they get to an
George, we can't hear you.
I just lost him.
Yeah, we lost you, George.
George.
Thanks, Jeff. That's helpful.
Okay. Okay. I'm not sure where you lost me, but
There you go.
it's going to be a generational project.
As it has been for at least a couple of generations
And
already.
already has been and will continue to be.
As my sainted grandmother used to say, I should live so long. Anything else? Amy, you want to tell us about the recent actions by the Board of Supervisors?
Sure, they approved the Laurel Hills Phase 2, Section 2, lots 11, 12, 13, minor subdivision plan, approved the Robert D. Ricketts minor land development plan and the Ricketts planning module. As George mentioned, they heard the presentation from PennDOT and their consulting team on the State College Area Connector project. The township has been informed that we will be given a seat on the committee of all the stakeholders, the other townships, and then any other agencies that have approving ability will also be on that committee. So the supervisors are, considering who they want to put on the committee. And they also did say, and they did send me after the meeting, their draft public participation plan. They said they will come to any Harris Township meetings that we want them to, that they will communicate as much as we want them to. They do want to have the public involved. So that's good because there is still some very bad blood in this town about that old SITS project.
Yeah.
The board concurred with the Planning Commission's recommendation that parking and storage of vehicles should not be added to the Village Commercial Zoning District. And the board set a public hearing and possible adoption for the Historic Resources Overlay Demolition Delay Ordinance for October 12th. There is some notification that we have to do through the MPC for that. That's why it's a month beyond what we normally do. There was at least one board member, it was Supervisor Lord, who felt that the wait period should be extended to 60 days because he felt in 30 days you couldn't actually get anything meaningful done to save a property. The board wants to get further input from the public through the public hearing process before they would reconsider that, moving it from 30 to 60 days. That's it.
Thanks a lot.
Do we have anything else for the good of the order? If not, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
I'll move we adjourn the August 17th Planning Commission meeting.
Second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? The motion carries. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Night.
Kent, did you?